Our second scripture reading from the epistles comes from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. The first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. You yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully mistreated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak, not to please mortals, but to please God, who tests our hearts. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the Pharisees came up with a question to test Jesus. Nobody likes a test. Well, maybe that's an overstatement. I'm sure that there's someone here already who's naturally just a good test taker, and they're saying to themselves, well, I like tests. I just sail through them without any problems, without giving a second thought. People like that are not my friends. Other people, like me, hear the word test, and you immediately get a knot in your stomach. No matter how much you prepare or study, you just freeze up when it comes time to take a test. I question my answers. I can remember erasing so many answers or trying to erase so many ovals that I had filled in that by the time I was done, you couldn't really tell whether it was filled in or not. It was just a smudge there on the paper, and that's usually when the panic really started to set in. I remember taking a test in Hebrew in seminary. The test at the end of the course included translating some verses of the Bible in Hebrew, translating them into English. And on the day when the test papers were handed out, I received my paper in the class, and the instructions on the paper said, translate numbers 1 through 4. And I looked at my sheet, and I was surprised that that was the only thing that was on it. Translate numbers 1 through 4. And I looked at my sheet again, and I thought, well, there must be something wrong here. My sheet doesn't have any numbers 1 through 4 in it. And I looked on the back side of the page, and it was blank too. And so after a few minutes, I decided that I'm going to have to go up to the professor and ask for a new test sheet. The professor was a man named Dr. James Mays. He was a distinguished, internationally known Old Testament scholar. He wasn't mean, but he was very serious, and he could be intimidating. So I walked up to the front where he was sitting at a table, and I whispered, Dr. Mays, there's something wrong with my test sheet. And he just raised his eyebrows. He didn't say anything, just raised his eyebrows. Look at my sheet, I offered. The only thing it says is translate numbers 1 through 4, but I don't have any numbers 1 through 4 written on my sheet. There must be a mistake here. Please give me a different test sheet. And Dr. Mays looked at me quizzically. Numbers 1 through 4, he repeated. That's right, that's what I said. My sheet doesn't have any numbers on it at all. That's the part that must have gotten left off of my test sheet. He squinted at me again, and he said it again. Numbers 1 through 4. I could tell he was trying to emphasize something, but I wasn't sure, and I said, that's right. Numbers 1 through 4, they're not there on my sheet. So very slowly, he said with precision, Numbers is a book of the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. It's the fourth book of the Bible. Open your Hebrew Bible and translate from the book of Numbers, beginning in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And so I looked at him and said the first thing that came to mind, Mazel Tov. And then I went and sat back down, and I have no idea how I passed that test. Nobody likes a test. I'm sure some of you are saying, well, I sort of like tests sometimes. Tests can be good. Tests are important. They help you to know whether or not you've learned something. And, of course, somebody else may be saying, well, there's another meaning to the idea of test behind simply right or wrong answers. Sometimes we test something to see how well it works or whether it's truthfully described. You wouldn't buy a car, would you, without going out and taking it for what? A test drive. They don't launch rockets over at Cape Canaveral without running all sorts of tests before they launch, right? And you wouldn't get surgery, or you wouldn't just up and take some kind of medicine without running a test to see if it was the appropriate treatment. So I guess the truth is that we face some sorts of tests all the times, every day in our lives. And I've titled my sermon today, if you noticed, The Stewardship Test. And you might be asking yourself, what sort of test is that? Well, here's the first possible question for the stewardship test. True or false? Stewardship is not about money. I was listening to a recorded service from another church, and the stewardship speaker for that Sunday, someone who was speaking just like Sue spoke to us this morning, the stewardship speaker for that Sunday began with this statement: stewardship is not about money. I know that's something that we say a lot, and I probably said it a lot myself, and I'm sure we all understand the idea behind it. In church, when we talk about stewardship, we really want to acknowledge an offering of our whole lives to God. We certainly believe that the entirety of our lives is a gift from God. And sometimes it feels like if we say about stewardship, if what we say, if it's completely only focused on money, then sometimes it feels like we've sort of cheapened what we have to say about God's grace and God's love for us, which encompasses our whole lives. No one wants to be accused of just focusing on money. No minister likes to hear someone come out of church and say, all you people ever talk about is money. But the Bible doesn't pull any punches about the idolization of money and wealth. It consistently describes money and wealth as one of the chief and most dangerous idols. Jesus said, you cannot serve two masters, God and money. So true or false, stewardship is not about money. How do you answer that test question? When I heard that speaker say that, I thought, well, but it is about money. And I began to imagine some different scenarios. Like, let's say the church gets a bill from the Orlando Utilities Commission. And I call and I say to OUC, hi, this is Pastor Dan from over at Park Lake, and we got the utility bill, but I want to tell you today that stewardship is not about money, so we won't be sending the payment in this month. How long do you think the lights and electricity would stay on here at the church? Or let's say I sit down with the church staff at the staff meeting, I say, I know this is the first of the month, it's payroll today, but let me be the first to remind you that stewardship is not about money. The bank called and said they don't have enough money to cover the payroll for this month, but I told them, folks, stewardship is not about money. So how long do you think that the staff would continue to show up for work, or how long before they needed to start to look for another place of work? True or false? Stewardship is not about money. Well, you might not like that first test question. So let's switch to another test question. True or false? Stewardship is just another name for fundraising. This test is getting harder as it goes along. Now, it's true. Most of the time when we talk about stewardship in church, we do so at the same time, or maybe we only talk about it at the same time, that we're asking for financial pledges for next year's budget, and we're trying to make plans, financial plans for the year ahead. So I can understand why someone would say stewardship is really just another name for fundraising. You're just trying to raise funds for next year's budget. That seems very interesting to me. You know, I've been recently to a number of different organizations, nonprofits, fundraising events, and they're wonderful charitable organizations. They're doing great work. But at those events, at their fundraising events, I've never heard them stand up and say, well, we're going to talk about stewardship today. They stand up and they say, we're talking about getting the funds that we need for this organization to continue to do the work it does. And we want you to give those funds, to give generously to our work. And our ability to do this work is directly related to your generosity. So we thank you for making your financial pledges. They don't get up and say, we're going to talk about stewardship today. Those organizations, they get up and they say, this is our once a year fundraising event. But in church, we say, this is the stewardship season. And we then go on to pretty closely tie stewardship with asking for financial support. Because if we go back to the first question, you remember, stewardship is about money. But how about the answer to this second question? Money's not all that stewardship is about. Stewardship isn't simply fundraising. We know we believe that, and we know it's important to remember that. Stewardship is about our relationship with God. We can't exclude money when we're talking about our relationship with God, but it's not everything of our relationship with God. Money isn't the only thing our relationship with God is all about. If money is the only thing that your relationship with God is about, then it seems pretty clear that money is your God, your idol. And we shouldn't be fooled or naive. That happens. Money and wealth and security can easily become the center of life. So maybe the stewardship test has something to do with discerning whether or not that's actually the case. Something to do with trying to figure out what it is exactly that is at the center of our lives. Or maybe if we put it differently, maybe stewardship tests us to see what is at the center of our lives, where and how your life is centered. When we measure, like with Helen's measuring stick this morning, when we measure how we're using our time or how we're using our abilities or how we are using our resources, we do get some picture of what is at the center of our lives. It could be our work. It could be our families. But measure it, and we're going to get some picture of what is at the center of our lives. It could be our hobbies. It could be our interests. It could be our passionate causes. But we're going to get some picture of what's at the center of our lives. It could be our personal goals, our expectations, our ambitions. What is it that is at the center of our lives? It could be a personal struggle, an addiction, a hardship. It could be worry, anxiety, growing cynicism and hopelessness over the direction of the way that the world is going these days. But when we start to measure, we're going to get some idea of what is at the center of our lives. What does the stewardship test say about you? What is at the center of your life? One Pharisee, a legal expert, decided to test Jesus with this question. Do you remember what the question was? I know it's been a while since Helen read the passage, but do you remember what the question was? This wasn't the first time they'd asked him questions. They'd been asking questions of Jesus for a while. First, the Herodians came up and asked Jesus about paying taxes. Do we have to pay Caesar's taxes? We didn't vote for him. Why should we have to pay him taxes? And then some Sadducees came up and asked him, if I marry my brother's widow, who's she going to be married in heaven? Who's she going to be married to? They just were coming up with one question after another to try and test him and to try and trap him. He'd been in Jerusalem. He'd been in the temple courtyards where he had been teaching and healing people. The public response was going well, so they were trying to generate these hostile questions. They're trying to trap Jesus in his own words, discredit him in front of the crowds, trick him into saying something that will alert the authorities that this guy is trouble. And so one legal expert, a Pharisee, decides to ask him, what's the greatest commandment? To test Jesus, a test question. Let's see if he knows his stuff. Let's see if he agrees with us. Let's see if we can get rid of him. Jesus gives the answer, which is straight out of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 and Leviticus 19. You shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, okay, maybe the Pharisees looked at each other and said, well, the guy knows his Bible. But before they can confer about what their next question will be, Jesus turns and poses them a question. And so now here's the stewardship test. Do you remember what the question was that Jesus asked the Pharisees? Do you remember the second half of the text that Helen read? Sure, we always remember Jesus' answer to their question. What's the greatest commandment? Love God, love your neighbor. Got it, check, no problem. But do we remember the question that Jesus asked us? Who is the Messiah? Is David's son the Messiah? Remember how the crowd sang when Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, Hosanna, Hosanna to the Son of David. And so Jesus asked them, how can David call his own son Lord? In other words, how can David call the Messiah God? He puts that question to the Pharisees. And then Jesus quotes Psalm 110, the psalm that's quoted more than any other psalm in the New Testament. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet, until I make your enemies your footstool. Here is Jesus saying, you can ask me all the questions that you want, but the only question that really matters is the question that I'm asking you. Who do you say that I am? Jesus Christ is the name of God, says Karl Barth. Otherwise, do we really have anything to talk to each other about when we claim to be talking about God? Jesus Christ, the one who lived briefly, died violently, and rose unexpectedly, is God. That's the claim Christians make about the world. And today, Jesus tells us that that claim is more important and far more interesting than any of the questions that we might bring to try and test Jesus with. So maybe the stewardship test just boils down to this one question Jesus always seems to ask, who do you say that I am? And then stewardship is really the lifelong process of asking if and how our answer to Jesus is reflected in everything we do. Everything. Every opinion we form. Every relationship we have. Every decision we make. Everything we decide to do each day, every word we speak to others, everything we spend our money on, everything. Everything. How does it reflect our answer to the question Jesus asked? Who do you say that I am? Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, God has entrusted to us the message of the gospel, and I'm not interested in what anybody else has to say about it. I'm not doing this work from deceit or impure motives or trickery. I only want to please the God who tests our hearts. Who do you say that I am? When we realize that our answers always don't measure up, because much of the time they don't. They don't measure up. You know it, and I know it, and maybe that's why we're here today, looking for some kind of answer, some kind of solution, some kind of explanation for the way things have gone for you this past week, or maybe for the way the whole world seems to be going right now. What happens when we realize that our answers don't measure up, that we don't have the right answer? Jesus just keeps asking. Like he asked Peter on that beach on the morning after Peter and his friends had gone back to fishing, after Jesus had arisen from the dead, and he goes to that lake where they're fishing, and John shouts out from the boat as he looks on the shore and sees someone, "It's the Lord," and Peter jumps into the water and swims to the shore, and while he stands there dripping wet, like his whole life depends on it, like his whole life depends on Jesus asking the question again, that's exactly what Jesus does. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? The stewardship test. I have a friend, Bob Barden, who's pastoring the Presbyterian Church of Mount Olive, North Carolina. You know, that's the place where they make all the pickles, Mount Olive, North Carolina, and there's a great little Presbyterian church there, and I love to listen to Bob's sermons. And I heard a sermon online from earlier this summer, and Bob was talking about stewardship, and he said, I remember when I was just getting started in the ministry, I went to an event sponsored by the Presbyterian, a stewardship event, and something happened there that changed my life and the whole way that I think about giving. I heard another pastor named Bob Bluford, Bob said. Bob Bluford got up and gave a stewardship presentation, a heartfelt plea about the importance of giving in the life of Christians. And then Bob Bluford remembered that the first place he went to serve in ministry was at a boys' home, a home for boys who had been orphaned, who were kicked out of their homes, who had no place to go, no resources, nothing to call their own. They were sent to this facility, and Bob Bluford was the chaplain there. And he remembered how on the first Sunday there they said, we have a worship service for the boys. And Bob said, okay. And so they all gathered for a worship service in a little chapel there. And then they said to Bob Bluford, now we have an offering in this worship service too. And Bob Bluford looked at the fellow and said, an offering? How in the world can you take an offering from these boys? They don't have anything. No, we have an offering. And so he said, okay. And so they started to pass the offering plates, and the offering plates were going up and down the rows where the boys were sitting, and you started to hear a penny drop into the offering plate, another penny drop into another, sort of like we might have used to hear money going into the 2 cents a meal or 5 cents a meal bucket as it went around. But these little boys were reaching in their pockets trying to find anything, but all you heard was a crinkle here and a crinkle there, and until Bob Bluford said he saw the plate get back to a little boy who was sitting in the back. When the plate got to him, the little boy sat there, and it was obvious he had nothing, no reason even to look in his pockets. It was obvious, and the boy sat there and looking at that plate. And then he reached up and pulled a button off of his jacket, and he put it into the plate. And Bob Bluford said it changed his life. It changed the way he thought about giving and about how he thought about being Christian from that point forward. The stewardship test, you try and answer that test. You remember that question Jesus asked. It might change your life. Amen.